Henry M. Jackson was a U.S. Senator from Washington State, a Democrat known for his advocacy on behalf of labor unions, welfare programs, and civil and human rights domestically, and his hawkish opposition to totalitarianism in foreign affairs, a Cold War liberal in the full sense of the term. Whitman College's Department of Politics has an annual Endowed lectureship in Jackson's name, designed to invite speakers who work at the intersection of domestic U.S. politics and international relations. Our collective project with respect to that endowment is to reimagine what the intersection between domestic and international politics looks like, to steer it away from Henry Jackson's politics, perhaps, while retaining and working within the form of that enterprise. This year, it was my hope to organize an event that discussed the centrality of race in U.S. domestic politics in relation to the question of Palestine. My initial inspiration for doing so were the connections protesters themselves drew between uprisings in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 after the murder of Mike Brown and concurrent uprisings in Gaza. I sent invitations to Noura Erakat and Robin D.G. Kelly, both of whom graciously accepted and join us here today. Noura is a human rights attorney and assistant professor at George Mason University. Her terrific and truly groundbreaking book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, was published just last week and is available at the Whitman College bookstore by Stanford University Press. And Robin is distinguished professor and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair of American History at UCLA, and the author of a number of foundational works from Race Rebels to Freedom Dreams to Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz, and Revolutionary Times. Now, in the process of organizing the event, Noura and Robin brought to my attention a problem with the initial framing of the event, and I want to share that problem with you today. I want to share it as a way to start the conversation, but also to introduce the framing that we arrived at. They pointed out that a nostalgic return to 2014 as a representative moment of solidarity, attending to analogies between experiences in Ferguson and Gaza, can actually reify identity categories between African Americans and Palestinians, and that there is a much more powerful form of solidarity possible in thinking of race as an analytic category. With that, we reframe the event around the following questions. How does the question of Palestine help us think race, justice, and solidarity? What does the question of Palestine teach us about understanding international law as politics, as a tool of domination, but also a site susceptible to strategic deployment through legal work advancing progressive causes? How can we theorize anti-blackness in relation to the question of Palestine? What historical imaginaries do increasingly public expressions of Black Palestinian solidarity recall and re-signify? And what possibilities do these expressions of solidarity introduce for the effort to address injustice in Palestine today and to create a more just world tomorrow? Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Robin Kelly and Noura Erakat.
Good afternoon. So you have to forgive me. I've been under the weather, so I might start coughing. But if I like go unconscious, just there's a phone number. Just hit the automatic dial for my wife, and she'll know what to do. Okay. It's sorry I have to sit up there when I talk. So I just want to first say thank you to Arash Davari for this invitation. He was a brilliant student at UCLA when I first met him, and you're so lucky to have him here. You don't understand like just how fortunate you are. I also told him I was very quick to accept this invitation for one very sort of simple reason, and that is that I attended Marcus Whitman Junior High School in Seattle, Washington, back in the 70s. I'm like, Marcus Whitman, that imperialist? So I'm like, I had to come back and face my trauma. I don't know what's worse, the massacre or the massacre that we experienced at Marcus Whitman Junior High School. So that said, the other reason I'm here is because he said that Professor Noura Erakat will be here. I will take any opportunity to share the podium with her, a stage, meeting, coffee, walk on the beach, anything. And I have to say that for those of you who don't know, I am the president of her fan club, so everyone invite me. Now, I'm always in awe of her brilliance, which is evident in her writing, speaking, media projects, public debates, and I really don't know anyone who understands the struggle in Palestine and its international ramifications with respect to the law better than Professor Ericott. So let me just begin, spend about 10 minutes just talking about the book and why it's important, and why it's important for understanding the question of Palestine more broadly, and then say a few words about the question of Black Palestinian solidarity, and then she'll follow me. Now, Justice for Some is a really brilliant history of a century of struggle for Palestine. Oftentimes we have books that begin in 67 to 48. She takes the whole story from 1917, from the Balfour Declaration and Mandate Palestine. And what she reveals is how law was contested ground, a tool for dispossession, a tool for settler rule, a tool for occupation, but also a tool of resistance, and an archive of historical reconstruction, because this is a work of history. She emphasizes the entwined relationship between law and politics, and cautions us against assuming that the law just automatically works in the favor of Palestinians if only the US and Israel would just step aside. It's more complicated than that. That's not how the law works. The law is always contested terrain. And in fact, she demonstrates how Israel has actually been more successful than Palestinians at what she calls legal opportunism. That is manipulating the law in the interests, in their own interests, and of course with US backing. Now, from its founding in 1948 until 1966, Israel relied on two things. As she argues, the myth that Palestinians do not exist as a national entity, and secondly, the state of emergency. That is, the state of emergency declared in 48 turned Palestinians into combatants, into threats, into non-citizens, into present absent individuals whose lands and properties, quote, could be arbitrarily confiscated for Jewish settlement, and of course, as racialized subjects, right? And this is very, very important. During the whole period, the Israeli state consolidated a system of racial control and population transfer, which is essentially a system of apartheid. And the comparison with South Africa the comparisons are really striking. For example, apartheid actually might have been implemented formally in 1948 with the rise of the National Party, but it took basically a decade to consolidate that system. An enormous amount of struggle, and law was part of that consolidation. So if you compare, say, what was happening in Israel with passages of laws like the absentee property law of 1950 or the law of return, and a number of other laws and actions that led to the consolidation of the apartheid system, which really doesn't kind of congeal until like the early 1960s. Same with South Africa. You have all these laws that are passed after 1948. The Immorality Act of 1950, the Population Registration Act of 1950, the Group Areas Act of 1950, the Suppression of Communism Act, the Native Labor Settlement of Disputes Act, the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act, the Bantu Education Act. All these acts are actually instantiated, they're laws that are meant to govern the system of apartheid, which again reminds us of the importance of law, right? Not just as justification, but actually something that has some legs to it. Now here I want to point out that the UN as an entity was surprisingly slow to respond to apartheid. And it's kind of, again, reading Nora's book made me realize that when you look at the first significant United Nations resolutions against apartheid, it's almost 20 years later. I mean, you think about 1966, which happens to also be the same year that Israel terminated its emergency regime. So even in terms of UN resolutions against apartheid in South Africa, it's really the mid-60s into the 70s that you begin to see UN resolutions in opposition instantiated in some kind of act, not in international law. Now, while Israel lifted the state of emergency It enshrined Palestinians as second-class citizens in civil law, followed by the 1967 war, which enabled new emergency measures in response to occupation. So most importantly, what she argues is that Israel built its legal justification for occupation and annexation upon the continued fiction of Palestinian national non-existence. That is to say that they are just refugees scattered, a refugee problem. And that position, in fact, shapes the outcome of UN Resolution 242. Now, UN Resolution 242, and her writing on this is really eye-opening. A lot of people who've written about 242 are now referring to her book as the definitive analysis. It was seen as a threat to Israel's occupation because all the signatories at first, of course, expressed a general consensus that against the admissibility of lands taken by conquest. That is to say, that lands taken by conquest are inadmissible. You can't annex them. But the wrangling over the language of 242 ended up benefiting Israel's position by doing three things. So she argues, one, it enshrined the fiction that Palestinians are not a sovereign people with the right to self-determination, but again, refugees without juridical status. Two, it established the principle that the return of land would be in exchange for peace with neighboring nations, rather than the unconditional restoration of original borders. So this land for peace, quid pro quo arrangement was a way to basically forestall the immediate restoration of land. And three, the removing of the definite article preceding occupied territories. Well, it's significant because this created a legal loophole since the particular territories that were then under occupation were not really named. It just was sort of a general, vague idea of the occupied territories, which allowed Israel to decide for itself which occupied territories count. So the withdrawal from Gaza, for example, would be deemed sufficient. At the same time, she shows how 242, which the PLO opposed initially, shifts to become a tool of Palestinian resistance. Again, the law is this contested ground. And through 242, it allowed Palestinians to make the legal claim for the West Bank and Gaza as territories. Movements today in support of Palestinian rights often invoke 242, notably the BDS movement. In other words, many of us, and myself included, are always quick to say that Israeli policies are illegal, that Israeli policies contravene international law, etc. And that's an easy thing, but she actually complicates the story, saying that in some respects, it's not that it's a contravention of international law per se, but that is a way in which international law is manipulated to make it seem legal. And so we end up upholding 242 as the legal and moral justification for ending occupation without paying attention to how the law was altered, weakened, and applied in accordance with political conditions like US backing, for example. Professor Ericott also presents an illuminating history of the PLO's efforts before the UN to inscribe the juridical status of Palestinian peoples in international legal instruments and institutions. And I think this is very, very important because, as I said 3 times, there was this assumption, or this claim at least, not assumption, that Palestinians have no legal claim. They're not a sovereign people, they're just sort of a refugee problem. And the claim that they do have juridical status is part of what the PLO did. And this was a legal strategy that complemented the political strategy, which was ultimately an anti-colonial strategy, or anti-colonial in character and global in scope. She shows how the 1917 war shifted the balance of power in the region. And although the US refused to recognize the Palestinian National Committee, or the PLO, Palestinians redoubled their commitment to armed struggle and the right to fight along with diplomacy. Among other things, it affirmed the status of Palestinians as a nation rather than a disparate group of Arab refugees. And this is where Arafat, shaped by the ideas of Fayez Said, articulated the dream of a single democratic secular state. The flip side of the strategy, though, is that Palestinian nationhood implied the acceptance of a state-centric global order. And that meant establishing a Palestinian state became an imperative. So the idea of a two-state solution was opened up by this imperative to have a state. And she writes about this brilliantly in the chapter Pragmatic Revolutionaries, which I don't have time to go into, but everyone has to buy the book. It's like you must. Just a couple more words, and let me just go to the last part I want to talk about. Of course, we know that the Oslo Accords proved to be disastrous, a reversal of this policy, the details of which you may know. But what she shows in her book is that in the name of the peace process, Israel had ramped up settlement building, criminalized all Palestinian use of force, expanded its right to use force against Palestinians, and recruited the Palestinian Authority, the presumptive governing structure of the future state of Palestine, to serve as the junior police over Palestinian people. And she shows that whereas the world condemned, say, South Africa's Bantustan policies under the guise of granting some limited independence or state status, proponents of the two-state solution actually celebrate the Palestinian Authority despite the fact that it looks more like a Bantustan. There's a refusal to recognize this as apartheid. Okay, I'm gonna skip over some other stuff. So, to reiterate, Professor Ericott's not saying international law and legal strategies are useless, nor are they the singular path to freedom, but the law must be manipulated, reinterpreted, contested, and informed by political struggles. And she lays out this brilliant strategy to move forward while acknowledging that the Palestinian Authority will never adopt it, so long as it's invested in the peace process and the U.S. role in it. And she does this by looking at Namibia and SWAPO, which I'm going to skip over that, but it's really worth looking. So finally, let me just go to the part I want to talk about in the end, which is, with the time I have left, just give me 5 or 6 minutes, I want to at least gesture at some of the questions surrounding public expressions of Black Palestinian solidarity and what that means, what it be called, what it be signified. So the question of international solidarity, specifically Black Palestinian solidarity, has been central to Professor Ericott's work for a very long time. If you haven't seen it, she helped produce this amazing video project called When I See Them, I See Us, that reveals a very important point, and that is that justice is indivisible and global, it knows no boundaries, and it is founded, and this is the key point here for what I want to talk about, not on shared experience, but on shared principles. That is, it's not the comparison of oppressions, but shared principles of liberation that is the basis for this kind of solidarity. In many ways, that video laid the groundwork for more and more high-profile people of color, notably African Americans speaking out in Palestine, and they in turn becoming targets of high-profile attacks. And some of you may know about some of these recent events, the firing of Mark Lamont Hill by CNN, the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's initial decision to deny Angela Davis its highest honor, and then they changed their mind about that. The attacks on Michelle Alexander for her New York Times op-ed piece criticizing Israel, and of course the ongoing war on Minnesota Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. All this, is part of the context for this conversation. And I'm not interested in re-narrating the events surrounding these attacks and their resolutions, but want to point out that it's not enough to root these events in the Ferguson-Gaza convergence. And this is part of what Arash was trying to explain. Rather, it's worth kind of going back to that post-67 moment, the era covered in chapter 3 of For Justice for Some. And this is when the convergence of Black urban rebellions and the Arab-Israeli war birthed the first significant wave of Black Palestinian solidarity and signaled the demise of what was then the U.S. Black-Jewish alliance, based on the notion of shared analogy of oppression, rather than shared principles of liberation. This was the moment when Palestine came to mean global anti-imperialism. And it's not an accident that in this period, U.S. groups like the Black Panther Party, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Committee of Black Americans for Truth about the Middle East, all came to see the Arab-Israeli war as a war of dispossession, and Israel as a full-blown imperialist power and a proxy of U.S. imperialism. This was a radical break from the past, because contrary to a lot of the myths, are also myths that were sparked in part by the Gaza-Ferguson convergence, Black people in the US and Palestinians were not natural allies. In fact, much of the black world identified with Zionism through Old Testament reading of the book of Exodus. In the US and the Caribbean, most black leaders in the black press embraced the founding of Israel because they recognized European Jews as an oppressed and homeless people determined to build their own nation. So when we talk about this moment of post-67 as a high point of black Palestine solidarity, we have to acknowledge that we're not talking about the majority of black people or the majority of Palestinians. We're talking about a black left political minority that extended solidarity to a Palestinian left based on radical anti-imperialist ideas or agenda. In fact, most black liberals and conservatives were actually ramping up their support of Israel. In June of 1970, civil rights leaders A. Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin published a full-page ad signed by 64 people in the New York Times calling on the US to provide Israel with more jet fighter planes, which is a prime example of Negro leaders doing the work of promoting foreign policy interests of another country. This is exactly what Congresswoman Omar is talking about. And I don't know if she was even born then, but this is when Arafat addresses the UN General Assembly with his famous guns and olive branch speech, and made it clear that Zionism is a racist colonial movement allied with imperialism. It is intent on territorial expansion and the occupation of the lands of neighboring countries, and the only clear solution was the establishment of a secular democratic state in all of mandatory Palestine. And even that concept of the single democratic state falls short of capturing the vibrant political imagination of that moment between 1967 and, say, the mid-70s. Elements of which oppose both nationalist and statist solutions for a free Palestine. In other words, question the idea of the state. So as Black Panther Party leader Huey P. Newton, something that Nora reminded me of, argued during a press conference in 1970, national self-determination was impossible under US empire. National sovereignty and real democracy, he argued, is a chimera in a world where the United States can overthrow regimes it doesn't like and prop up those it does. Our very survival, Newton insisted, depended not on creating new states, but on completely transforming society. So he says, this transformation can only take place by wiping out US imperialism and establishing a new earth, a new society, and a new world. So politically and strategically, the correct action to take is not separation, but world revolution in order to wipe out imperialism, and then people will be free to decide their destiny. So the post-67 radical insurgencies were more than nationalist struggles for a modern nation state as a path of decolonization. This is something we sometimes forget, or it's erased from the history, from the narrative. But as Adom Getachew suggests, ought to be understood as world-making rather than nation-building. Behind these black expressions of solidarity with Palestine lay a vision of world-making rather than a politics of analogy or identity, and that the eruption of post-67 history into the present struggles to end occupation, dispossession, exploitation, and violence in Palestine and the US has been a catalyst for imagining revolution as opposed to plotting coalition. So in closing, what brought Palestinian and black activists together in that moment, and I want to sort of think about that, was not just a recognition of parallel oppressions, humiliations, violence, and carcerality under occupation, but a shared vision of liberation, a vision that extended beyond the nation state to the transnational, to the world. In the final chapter, the conclusion of Professor Ericott's book raises that question of what's beyond the state, what's beyond that? And that's a question that it's hard to raise, hard to discuss because we're living in it. But we're here to sort of open our imagination, so thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. What time is it? Is it time for afternoon? I just want to say, I want to start this by saying that what you all are witnessing right now is probably the greatest gift that any student, any scholar, any writer can ask for, which is to be in the audience of one of her mentors and teachers. I've never formally studied with Robin, if I may. Professor Kelly. I've never been a formal student in a classroom, although I have been in a long time remote classroom of my own making in his robust body of work that has constantly pushed me in my own thinking. And so what you're seeing right now is the culmination of one of my own freedom dreams, which is to be, not only to share the stage, but to have Robin comment on the book and provide such an illustrious account and a detailed account of that work. So thank you for that opportunity. Thank you, Arash. Thank you, Whitman College, and to you all for having us here to do this. What I want to do is, and as you saw, I continue to be a student, right? And that's, I think, what most academics are. We're just perpetual students, a little bit grown up, and with more people listening to us with time. But I was, taking notes as fast as possible. I want to comment on some of the things that Robin was saying, but also then pick up maybe on some of the themes raised about Black Palestinian solidarity as an analytic, rather than as a movement of identitarian politics. So first, let me start off by saying this concept of exception. So one of the things that the book does is to focus on, and why I start in 1917 as opposed to 1948 with the creation of Israel, or 1967 and the onset of the occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is because in 1917 we see the crystallization of a legal structure of exception. And exception is not unique to Palestinians. It is a legal structure that British Empire actually introduces to the world, which basically purports that a sovereign imperative justifies the suspension of normal law in order to institute a martial law or another exceptional emergency regime in order to restore order. Now that framework of exception, right, becomes embodied in none other than our human rights treaties. So all of our human rights law, as much as we think that it's a natural legal corpus, is actually a framework of positive law. It's been regulated, it's legislated, it's written, it's a treaty, a multilateral treaty. And there is Common Article 4, which basically preserves the territorial sovereignty and the integrity of all states in the case of a public emergency. So within our human rights law, we have this preeminent right of states to suspend individual laws in order to preserve whatever they declare as necessary for their self-preservation. It's a deep contradiction, so that when you advocate for human rights law, you're also advocating for the rights of states to decide what is in their best interest. And they have this catch-all framework of exception that enables them to do that. Now in the literature, exception is debated. On the one hand, as basically a sovereign right that is uncontestable and is a zone of lawlessness, where political prerogatives can be achieved. On the other side of that debate is a pushback to say that it's not necessarily a zone of lawlessness, but it is a zone of lawfulness. And so I build on that to push and say, yes, it is a suspension of the law that becomes a permanent structure of governance under the framework of exception. But that it is not lawless, it is lawful. Because if you are a powerful state, you can very much use your power in order to suspend the law to get away with whatever it is you want to get away with. But that is not what the most powerful states have done. What they have done is to suspend the law and to argue that because their circumstances are so exceptional that no other law applies. So for any of you who are law school bound, you'll learn that the most important thing in legal jurisprudence, at least in US legal jurisprudence, is the idea of precedent. So that you're either going to apply law by precedent or analogy. But what happens when your fact pattern is so unique that there is no precedent and there is no analogy? It creates the justification to create new law where no law existed. And we know this in law as a sui generis framework. And so what I'm showing in 1917 is that the Balfour Declaration, which declared that there was no such thing as a Palestinian people, 90% of the indigenous population of the land, the mandate of Palestine, is Arab, is Muslim and Christian, including Jews, right? It also includes Jews. But what the Balfour Declaration does is to say that that 90% of the population will only be entitled to civil and religious rights in a Jewish national home. How do you do that? How can you possibly do that when the rest of the former territories of the Ottoman Empire that are legislated and designated as Area A under the mandate system are basically set up for independence, eventual self-rule and self-determination, through declaring an exceptional fact pattern. And that it is a sui generis. They describe, the League of Mandates describes the Palestine Mandate as sui generis and says that the exception is justified by two things mostly. Right? One is the noble imperative of establishing a Jewish national home. So it's this necessary thing that must be accomplished for the world. But the other one is a racist argument, that the Palestinians themselves are basically unable to regulate, to govern themselves, and besides, and in the words of Lord Balfour, who cares about the whims of some 700,000 Arabs, who are now obviously a 10 million person population, right? They didn't account for natural population growth. So, but in this moment, we have this framework of exception that becomes enshrined in international law and policy that continues to this day to regulate the question of Palestine. So that's why 1917, and that's why exception, and exception is not unique to Palestinians. That framework of exception is used in every settler colonial framework in order to negate the juridical national status of native peoples. It's also used in the United States in many ways. In order, some would argue that the structure of exception is basically how we regulate the lives of black communities in the United States. It's outside a normal realm of law, because there is a form of exceptional governance that hasn't been enfolded within and so remains without. But then there's the critique of inclusion, of basically we include these populations into our fold only to exclude them as a matter of law. And so, okay, so let me not continue there. Let me see what else I want to tell you about the structure of exception. And I also want to tell you a little bit about Robin mentioned what the PLO does when one of my, chapter 3 is basically the chapter that I thought was going to be the high point of Palestinian resistance, right? The story I narrate is basically the success of Zionist thinkers, pioneers, militias that eventually become the state of Israel, right? It's a success story for them. That they are able to basically now be the single sovereign of the entire Palestine Mandate between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Now, unfortunately for Israel, they have a problem, which is that they've created their own Frankenstein, which is now, they also, because they are the single authority, they also regulate the lives of Palestinians that they neither include as citizens nor recognize as sovereigns of their own state. So notice in the recent elections that we just saw 2 weeks ago, neither the Jewish Power Party, it's literally called the Jewish Power Party, okay, and it is based and comprised of Kahanist parties that believe in the supremacy of Jewish life. This is who Netanyahu aligned with himself and is likely to form his new government with, and the Blue and White Party list, which is led by a former military leader, Gantz. Neither of them nor any of Israeli voters commented on the fact that 6 million Palestinians could not vote in the elections.
And yet, whoever is elected will directly impact those Palestinian lives. This is a situation of explicit apartheid. And yet it doesn't come up in any debate, whether presidential, prime ministerial debates, or in newspaper and popular debates. It's taken for granted that 6 million Palestinians who can't vote doesn't matter. That is so normalized within Israel's system. In many ways, not exactly, but at least I want us to provoke us to think, in many ways that we normalize the disenfranchisement of convicted criminals in the United States, right? Who are also out of sight, out of mind, right? Remotely housed in cages outside of our urban centers. We can't see them. We don't care how dehumanizing their conditions are. And for us, it's normalized that they can't vote. And so far that it's come up recently in the public debate, the idea is, well, let some of them vote, but not the rapists and not the murderers. Without taking into question, without critically examining the distinction between who is a criminal and who is a lawbreaker. So this is the work drawing on the work of abolitionists like Angela Davis, who asked this question. What is the difference between somebody who breaks the law and someone we designate as a criminal? Obviously, I'm not in my classroom, so I can't make you answer my question. But that distinction is everything. We convict the criminal in a court of law and a legal system that is also predicated and established on very racist norms that we can trace and empirically demonstrate. And so we have a number of lawbreakers who govern us, literally, right? A number of lawbreakers who are in the highest places of government, and we do not question their right to vote, their right to lead. This is the work of Derica Purnell. She's a young scholar and an abolitionist. She just recently published a piece that raised all these questions in The Guardian. I encourage you to read. She's also a mentee of Robin, so all these good things coming through. And yet we say with forthright righteousness, right? But not rapists and not murderers. Without questioning the very structure that created and differentiated those two categories of criminal and lawbreaker. So why do I even say that, and how is it relevant here? It's everything. It's everything. If we are thinking about Black Palestinian solidarity, not as a form of identity politics, but as an analytic through which we think about the world that we can have and the world that we should build, these are the ways of thinking about who we construct as worthy, who we construct as mattering, who we construct as dispensable, who we construct as consequential. When we think about fear and self-defense, we never ask who has the legitimate right to fear, right? Because if your fear is legitimate, then so too is your self-defense. But if your fear is illegitimate, then you can never defend yourself. And any violence that you use in the name of protecting yourself is cast as criminal and terroristic. So these are some of the ways that this analytic enables us to think transnationally. And precisely why I think Robin is absolutely correct that Black Palestinian solidarity is not between Blacks and Palestinians, all right? It is between people of political orientation who have a vision of the world we live in, an analysis of the world we live in, and an analysis and a vision for the future that we can build together, right? So when, for example, when I helped produce this 3-minute video that Robin is also featured in called When I See Them, I See Us, we got a lot of pushback. The video is a beautiful set of vignettes of Black Palestinian solidarity and its articulation and common themes of oppression and of the future. And I got pushback from Black viewers who criticized it and said, "We're not terrorists. We fight a noble struggle. We've never launched a rocket at any white people." Okay? Well, wait for it, because it gets worse. And then I got pushback from Palestinians who said, we're not thugs or criminals. We are fighting a national liberation struggle to free our people and our land. So why are you comparing us to them? Right? This is just an anecdotal story that helps reveal how this is a political commitment and not an identity one. And that political commitment has historic roots, as Robin traced for us, in the divergence between Black thought. Black thought in the United States, right, is incredibly rich. And yet we tend to, because of our lack of study of it, create it into this homogeneous monolith, Black, right? And not to distinguish that there's a tradition of Black radical thought and a tradition of Black civil rights that aspires to achieve political sovereignty. Two different things, so that the NAACP and the Urban League are distinct from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Black Panther Party. Similar in the Palestinian movement, we have different intellectual legacies. Those that have aspired to achieve political sovereignty in the form of a state, who I describe as the pragmatist front. In fact, they describe themselves as the pragmatist front, right? That divides along different lines, and even Fatah has different pieces of that. So Fatah divides over those lines. And the Palestinian and the rejectionist front that rejected political sovereignty and the Palestinian state for the sake of liberation of all of Palestine and revolution, and not just all of Palestine, but to liberate the Middle East and the Arab world from US imperialism and capitalism in the Middle East. These are the historical legacies that develop and crystallize post-1967, which we see fade, and now in the, I guess what I would describe and what I do describe as the renewal of Black Palestinian solidarity made very clear during the Ferguson Gaza moment of 2014. And I understand that some of you who are seniors, that was 5 years ago, right? So some of you, you're young, right? This is a major historical moment that's going to be written about for a long time. But that moment of renewal marks an analytical return, not to a moment of solidarity between two peoples, but an analytical return to a vision for what our future should be, what we should be fighting for, right? Which is a new world, the world making that was so beautifully articulated here. So I'll end there and continue the discussion with Robert. Thank you.
So I know that some of you need to get to class at 1 p.m., so we want to give you an opportunity now, if you need to leave. And then what we'd like to do is really open it up for a conversation as a collective and as a group. And if I may, I might take the opportunity to start by asking you a question about sailing. You have this metaphor in your book about the law as a sail. And you talk about the relationship between politics and law, the law and legal work. And I kind of want to maybe ask you to help me resolve something that I struggle with sometimes teaching here at Whitman College, which is, or just teaching in general at an institution of higher education, which is sometimes, we teach about material that talks about politics, and the pushback that I get is, well, what about actually doing politics? And the implication is that, we're engaging in theoretical work, we're engaging in all this reading and writing, but it's not actually having an impact on the world. And when I was reading your introduction, I got the sense that there was this kind of emphasis on the political aspect of critical reading skills, on kind of engaging in a kind of hermeneutics with respect to the law. And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that, maybe as a defense on my behalf. But also if that can be maybe taken too far, you know, where we disengage. You know, we think that it's just enough to read books. So where does one strike the balance between those two things?
Okay, so first of all, you all should love Professor Araj. And thank him. So you asked many questions in that, right? So let me try to tackle them one. What? Oh, I thought you were telling me to sit. Yeah, come sit. Your seats. They're so much more comfortable. And in case of an emergency, it makes it easier to get up on your feet, right? Okay, so there were several questions. One was about the analogy of the law and politics. The other one was about, you know, the role of politics and the relationship, you know, how we understand basically the argument that the law can be an apology for politics and how I push back on that. And then the third is basically about how we engage in activism, right? Where do we draw the line? So let me start really quickly. I created an analogy that basically says that think of the law like a sail on the boat, right? In order to move anywhere, you need the sail. But what direction that boat is going to move in has nothing to do with the sail. It has to do with the winds blowing, right? And so that those winds that are blowing are the political movements, is the historical context, is the balance of power, is the legal strategy, right? So that's kind of how I describe that relationship. And I also say very bluntly, as someone who self-identifies as a human rights attorney, draw the sail when useful, right? What's the other? I'm not a sailor. Draw it when useful, pull it down. What? It's the opposite. Okay, how about I speak in my language? Put up the sail when useful, put it down when not useful. Create a new sail when possible, all right, to advance your goals. Now, some may see this and say, oh my God, but that's a violation of, you know, our fidelity to the law, and in order to be, you know, if you really want to be, that's just politics. And then you're being manipulative. But the whole point of my argument is to say that nobody is loyal to the law. The law has no meaning. The law is indeterminate. And in order for it to have meaning, it has to be subject to some sort of adversarial process. Hello, lawyers, right? And then judicial interpretation. And how judges interpret the law has everything to do with a moment in time. So for example, think about the Bush administration's legal argument, right? That everybody in Guantanamo Bay was outside of constitutional reach, so that constitutional law didn't apply, nor did the Third Geneva Conventions on the Rights of Prisoners of War apply. The Bush administration engaged in what I describe as legal work, which is a term that I draw from another teacher of mine, Duncan Kennedy at Harvard Law School, to basically make the argument that they were in a zone of exception. Okay? Now, at this time, their argument might have been successful. And we see a number of appeals and Supreme Court decisions around this time that basically evidences a battle between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive branch of the United States. All right? But the Supreme Court ultimately rules that this is within the reach of U.S. constitutional law because Guantanamo Bay is within the U.S.'s territorial jurisdiction, and so that it reaches it. But that wasn't an inevitable outcome. And so much of the Supreme Court decision was shaped by the revelation of torture in Abu Ghraib. In Iraq, the secret prison in Abu Ghraib, where the images come out of the Iraqi prisoners being attacked by dogs, subject to sexual assault, subject to torture. Those images influenced the Supreme Court to basically reinstill some sort of lawful framework and push back. But what if they didn't? The outcome would be completely different. So that's that example that I give. So the other thing that I try to say is, well then, you know, some might argue that the law is just a stand-in for power and for politics. Might makes right. And so what is the rest of this nonsense? And I push back against this too because that's not necessarily true. Weaker parties have used it as a tool of resistance, right? The fact that weaker parties, and Palestinians aren't even a state and have been able to use the law to advance their interests in the 1970s. So a stateless population, a national liberation movement was able to use it against the United States and Israel, right? Which evidences that it can also be a tool of resistance. And even when it's not used as a command or as a punishment, the law is still serving what constructivists would describe as internalized norms that shape our decision making. And then finally, what about theory and politics and what you should do about it? So here I was telling Robin the story. We were at breakfast this morning with some remarkable student theorists. So looking at you all. And I turned to Robin when we left and I was like, oh my God, I never read when I was a senior. That was amazing. Mind you, I got straight A's, but I didn't. Yeah, but, which is so bad. I shouldn't even say this because what if my students ever see this? Because I get on their backs for not reading. Because I was too busy organizing. I had a job as an organizer. I was a student activist. We were taking over buildings. We launched the first divestment campaign at UC Berkeley in 2001, before BDS was launched in 2005. We occupied Wheeler Hall during midterms and kicked all the students out. Told them that this building has now been occupied. If you find that this is inconvenient, try living under occupation for 45 years. And by the time I finished law school, I was telling Arash, if anybody told me I was going to go back to school, I would have scoffed. Because I could not wait to organize. I could not wait to be just in total political commitment. But it was the limits of politics and the limits of legal advocacy that planted seeds of critical inquiry that led me back to the academy and back to learning, so that now I can not only think about how to fight, but that I can have the capacity and the radical imagination to dream about new ways forward. So what I would say is, yeah, you could be a fighter, but if you really want to expand your imagination, you should be reading.
I just want to weigh in on two of those questions. One having to do with the law. I mean, all the examples that Professor Ericott laid out are amazing. And there's some U.S. examples I can think of as a historian. We have organizations like the National Lawyers Guild, the National Committee Against Racist and Political Repression, the International Labor Defense back in the 1930s, the Civil Rights Congress, that were made up of lawyers. And you have cases like the Scottsboro case, even Mumia Abu-Jamal. I mean, one of the reasons why he hasn't been executed is because the combination of the legal struggle and the struggle in the streets, which brought visibility to his case, let alone all these other cases. The United Nations became a platform for Paul Robeson and William L. Patterson and others to basically submit a dossier charging the U.S. for genocide. This is like 1951. And so there's all kinds of ways in which this law is contested. Things become visible that wouldn't be visible otherwise. I mean, cases that would never come before without that kind of struggle. So I think it's really, really important to see those things together. Sometimes we look at the ACLU as an example of advocacy, and they are that, but ACLU also is limited in terms of what it does. Some of the organizations I mentioned are actual political organizations that have a particular agenda against racism, against other forms of oppression. The other thing on activism, I just want to reiterate that I'm much older than my colleague here. So I mean, I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s. I was a grown person, believe it or not. I was in college. But in the mid-80s, the UC system, UCLA. And one of the things that was pretty common in those days was that no one was in a movement or an operation without being in a study group. There were two sides of the same coin. I didn't know anyone who wasn't in a study group. A study group, by the way, is not a group of people trying to pass their exams. A study group is you pick your own readings. Sometimes, there were Marxists, there were Trotskyists, there were anarchists, there were, militant environmentalists. We were reading stuff, reading materials. So when we built tent cities on UCLA's campus, we went in there with a knowledge of not just UN resolutions on South Africa, but the history of South Africa, the history of corporate intervention, but also theoretical ones. I mean, we were reading, I remember reading Edward Said in a study group. I was never assigned Said. I was never assigned Samir Amin in a class. It was in a study group. Walter Rodney, C.L.R. James, Angela Davis, when she wrote Women Race and Class, that was a study group. So we picked those stuff for us to read and discuss and debate and struggle. And one of the things about study groups is that people's feelings didn't get hurt when you critiqued the work and critiqued each other's position because it wasn't personal. And so in order for us to move forward to be able to be intellectually engaged politically, it also means rethinking even our relationships with one another and not see ourselves as individual capital to build up our brand, but to really see ourselves as part of a movement. And that conception means that the intellectual work and political work are inseparable in many ways.
I'd like to open it up to questions from you all. And we have Basil and Fatih with these boxes that are also microphones.
Oh, wow, okay. My question is, in the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that we've been talking about, how hard do you think it makes having a peaceful solution when every Israeli is conscripted into the military and learns at a young age that the Palestinians are the enemy?
That's a really, really good question. So, one thing I'll say is that I describe this as the Palestinian struggle for freedom throughout the book to avoid the language of conflict. And this is not a critique. This is actually something that I'm learning to not use, because when we say conflict, that marks a particular way of flattening the earth and of removing power disparity. It's almost like talking about, black struggle against de jure segregation as a racial conflict, right? When it was a very clear, visible struggle for freedom and equality. Now that might make some of us comfortable, right? And we have a high premium on comfort in our discussions. I see it in my class. People want to say that they're against racism, but don't want to define what that is, and don't want to talk about it, right? It's what Nikhil Palestine recently revealed to me in his work. We have equated saying race, as being equivalent to racism, so we can't talk about race, because if we do, then we're the racists. We're talking about it. So here language is really important, but so too is I think in learning the space of being uncomfortable. If you're uncomfortable, you're doing the work. So continue to do it. The question is wonderful because it's asking about a society that's conscripted. Everybody in Israel is conscripted at the age of 18 to serve in the military. So that means from a very young age, they have to believe that what they are doing is righteous, right? Against all images, against whatever discourse there is, against Palestinian calls for freedom, they have to believe that what they are doing is righteous, which means that we have to disbelieve what Palestinians are telling us about their lives, which means that they can't see what's happening, right? And so part of that is the fact that most Israelis don't travel to the West Bank, ever. And the reason that they don't travel to the West Bank, as far as they tell me, forget Gaza. Oh my God, that's another story altogether. But the reason that they tell me is they can't travel, and Israel makes it illegal for them to travel there, imagine, for their own safety. For their own safety. And yet, Palestinians, if any of you have ever visited, visitors, Palestinians will welcome you with open arms, so long as you don't come with, an M16 rifle or riding in a tank. They will welcome you with open arms, with hospitality, and are creating space to learn from one another. The other irony of this law that prohibits Israelis to enter the West Bank is the fact that they're there as settlers. Anyway, 600,000 of them. who live in Jewish-only settlements that are surrounded by roads that are for Israelis only. And how do you regulate that? By different colored license plates. So Palestinians have green license plates, Israelis have yellow license plates. This is so explicit. That's how you move around. There are checkpoints that prevent Palestinians from movement that Israelis are never subject to. More than this, 20% of Israel's population is Palestinian. So the truth of the matter is that the populations are actually inextricably located within this territory. The only thing that separates them is a vast system of law, of discriminatory laws that tantamount to apartheid, right? Now, despite the fact that this is what, and then if you refuse to serve in the army, then you're labeled a traitor and you have to serve time in prison. So those are conscientious objectors. There's also a movement of Israeli soldiers known as Break the Silence, who will actually discuss anonymously, because they don't want to be held to account, which is a critique of them, but will discuss their rules of engagement in combat that demonstrates the excessive use of force through Israelis' own testimony. Okay? Now the only two comments I want to make about these latter two things is one, that in most of the discourse, I live in Washington, D.C., so I get this all the time from the think tanks and from congressional members. They're asking Palestinians why you teach your children to hate, and how our textbooks are actually teaching Palestinians to despise Jews. That's the explanation, because you can't, how else do you explain the situation? You make it devolve into a problem between two peoples who can't get along, rather than a structure of oppression that needs to end. Right? So that's one. So I appreciate your question for at least not replicating that. The second thing is, this whole thing about believing Palestinians. How often have you seen a Palestinian speak? I'm serious. Sometimes I feel like a unicorn. Because people have never seen a Palestinian, let alone Palestinians speak and then speak, English. Right? Or the way that they've seen Palestinians, they expect me to look a certain way. Right? How did I escape my family's tyranny? To be, you know what I mean? Like, that's my main conflict. I'm dead serious. I'm dead serious. It's so unfortunate. It's, you see panels, watch the news, pay attention. Watch the news when something on Palestine comes up and see how many Palestinians you see on the media speaking for themselves. When I started getting on the media, it was a coup. It was an absolute coup. We get spoken on behalf of, which is part of this thing of not believing those who are living through this, which is part of what my book is trying to do as well, which is rely on Palestinian sources to tell our own stories. So that's also part of the work.
Just add a couple other things. First of all, I encourage everyone to actually go visit the West Bank, because what you actually see the kind of cultural militarism that you're talking about. And I have to say, it's something striking to see, like, an 18-year-old kid with an M16 and who is basically patting down people coming through with a kind of imperious attitude, but it's a kid. And the level of violence that's not, you may not see it played out. It's really striking. And then when you say, well, who's in the military? Well, in certain places, I've been to Hebron, where you see Ethiopian Jews who are in the military, who are also policing what is a clear Jim Crow system, Jim Crow street, where on part of the street only settlers could walk, other parts of the street only Palestinians could walk. You see Ashkenazi Jews, some of whom in the day were members of the Black Panther Party, who now are fully incorporated into the system of militarism. But let me just say two things about that, to go outside of Israel for a minute. Sometimes that stuff could backfire. And so Break the Silence may not be a mass movement, but it's a movement that is really exposing the levels of violence in ways, and the fact that there's state repression on anyone who speaks about that is telling. But if you look at Portugal, now what's interesting is that most of you may know the story, but Portugal is waging this colonial war in Angola, Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Cape Verde Islands, and under a fascist rule of Salazar. And the way that that colonial war came to an end was that the resistance was overwhelming, the Portuguese were being beaten, but that wasn't the thing. It was that the military, the violence was so great, and the military was so beat down that they had a coup d'etat and overthrew Salazar, right? And that ended the colonial wars. They said, this is ridiculous. So imagine U.S. involved in Vietnam, and if the military came back and said, you know what, Johnson, we just overthrew Johnson. It's basically what happened. So there's a possibility. I'm not saying that this is actually on the table, because I'm a little more pessimistic than that, because part of what comes, as Nora was talking about, part of what comes with it is this perception of who a Palestinian is. If you don't see Palestinians and you invent them, they're the ones that all walk around with guns. Right? They're the ones that are out to kill you. They're basically just all thugs, essentially. If you believe that, then the idea of sort of supporting a transformation in the government to open up the possibility of a single democratic state is just impossible. Nonetheless, if you can't continue to occupy and violate people's rights and engage and have a military culture without it coming back, so the blowback is something we have to watch out for, I think.
So I'm in a race and international politics class this semester, and I was just wondering, like, we've been talking a lot about how the UN has defined race, like, over the years, and like the post-1945, like, universalism of like race in terms of like race does count as like both like people who are like Jewish like fit into like that's like the idea that like the oppression that was undergone by the Jews during like the Nazi period is somehow like equivalent, which it's not, but also it doesn't mean it's like worse or better than like anything like. I'm like getting lost. But basically, what I'm trying to ask is like how does like the international definition of race like influence or maybe like change like how we interpret the law in terms of what do we determine as racist and what we determine as not racist, and does that like give one party like more legal precedent than another? In the conflict.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
You should talk, you know, okay, I'm gonna hand it off and ask my teacher a question after I answer part of that question, okay? Which is to say, let me just remember the question that I want to ask you, which is basically the critique of, the Black radical critique and the turning point after the international condemnation of Jewish mass annihilation perpetrated by the Nazis, and the critique that this form of kind of Nazi purity, right, of white supremacy, was something that was perfected by colonial powers in the colonies, but was otherwise not condemned because it was meted against non-white populations, right? So that's a really important part of the story, and that's the what is it, the prologue? The prologue. Y'all know English is my second language, right? So I make these mistakes all the time. Don't get on my Twitter. People are always on my Twitter like, oh, you just messed up again. So, but I'm learning. So, but the prologue to the answer that I'm about to give. It's the pushback against this framing of Nazi atrocities as the height of racist violence and subordination that's moved by basically the global South, who are now engaged in wars of liberation across the globe in order to throw off the yoke of colonialism and the yoke of imperialism. They become increasingly and incrementally members of the United Nations. So at the establishment of the League of Nations, there's 42 founding members. Right now there's 194. That jump, and by 1960 there's 55 members, right? That jump, that number of states is increasing because this is precisely the anti-colonial movement where colonized peoples are becoming part of the international system and are engaged in world making. It's their efforts. It's their efforts, these wars of liberation, the national liberation movements, and these newly freed independent states. They established the first human rights treaty. So in 1945, we have the UN Declaration of Human Rights. The UN Declaration is not a treaty, it's a declaration. It's basically, you know, we wish and we hope that we can all be great one day, right? The first UN treaty is in 1965, and it's the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Racial Discrimination. That actually precedes the two other founding documents, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, Cultural Rights, that then enshrine self-determination as the primary human right, right? So the framework of what is racism is one that's being theorized, and so this also goes back to Arash's first question. The theory that's being created is being created by the activists themselves and by the militants themselves who are creating new laws to serve their interests. The next treaty that enshrines this is the 1973 Convention Against Apartheid, which now creates apartheid and lifts apartheid to a crime against humanity, right? And so these are also, by the way, the U.S. opposes. The U.S. opposes these treaties because what's at risk for the United States? Our entire system, which is a racist system. And the battle becomes not over the treaty itself, but the battle becomes framed as a battle of presidential authority because the Senate is empowered to ratify treaties. And so rather than frame this as, you know, a battle over racism, instead we obscure the entire conversation about the rights of the separation of powers within our executive, you know, within our branches. Which is, again, we're not talking about racism. We're just not talking about it. And so how does that get refracted into these discussions today? In what becomes a battle of two sides, right? And a desire to make us all comfortable and all get along without actually dealing with those conditions that are making us unequal.
Exactly. So you're taping this, right? Because you know this is your next book. This is like your book. Everything you say. Okay, so let me just go back. This is a really good question. Let's go back to sort of 3 stages very quickly. So before the League of Nations, this is before the League of Nations. Or around the time of the League of Nations, W. Du Bois in 1920 writes an article called The Souls of White Folks. And I would suggest you all read it. It's about 12, 13 pages. And in it, it's an interesting kind of poetic meditation on sort of the Western hypocrisy and the presence of global white supremacy in the aftermath of the Great War. So World War I was the first war of industrial scale killing, where civilians were subject to, that's in theory, But he reminds us that all the technologies used in World War I were practiced by the French in Madagascar, by the British in the Montebello War, in Sudan, the Gatling gun, the Maxim gun, aerial bombing by the French in Morocco. In other words, in the late 19th century, they had already been practicing on colonial peoples, right? And they don't matter because they're colonial peoples. So it's not a subtle question about race here. It's very explicit and very clear. And that sets up, in some ways, what becomes the Nazi atrocities. And so it's Du Bois, it's Oliver Cox, it's Ralph Bunche, among other people, all before Hannah Arendt. I'm not taking anything away from Hannah Arendt, because Hannah Arendt wrote a really brilliant book where she talks about some of these things, the colonial origins of fascism. But in the 1930s, they're writing about this. And in fact, it's Du Bois at the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, which is like laying the groundwork for the United Nations, where he says, look, let's declare colonialism a crime against humanity. And they're like, excuse me? We can't hear you. What? Let's declare, and they didn't go for that. And this in some ways is implied in the question. So by the time you get to the United Nations up the part, they, like Nora said, yes, there's this Declaration of Human Rights, 48. And it's great, it's flowery. Mrs. Roosevelt had something to do with that language. Great, wonderful. But it's really not until the 1960s that you begin to actually see anti-racist resolutions. That's a long time. That's a damn long time. That's like 2 decades. And that gap is something we have to pay attention to, because it's in that gap that you see both the instantiation of new forms of racial domination in terms of apartheid in South Africa, the creation of the State of Israel, the Dixiecrats in North America. It means all these things that are happening, and the struggle to overturn that becomes intense. And really at the moment when you begin to see more participants in sort of international agencies like the UN and more independent nations, that this becomes an issue. That's not to say, not to take away from the fact that even within those independent nations, you have other forms of racial violence within those nations. It may not be based on forms of kind of white supremacy or black-white discourse or anything, but other forms of violence, whether you're talking about China, you're talking about Rwanda, even you're talking about in Mozambique and elsewhere. We see this as well. But the structures are in place to begin to at least address, at least to think about race in the law. The only thing is that right now we're at this point where colorblind race discourse is like the highest form of racism, in that like Nora was saying, it eliminates in some ways the possibility of discussing or acknowledging racism and ongoing forms of racism by virtue of the fact that any kind of identification of race itself is racist. And David Theo Goldberg has this really terrific little book called Are We All Post-Racial Yet? Which lays out a critique of that, the colorblind racism.
I'm reminded in what you just said of Vijay Prasad's The Darker Nation. And he talks about Sovi and the coinage of the term Third World, and how Sovi was a resistance fighter, and how he basically articulated Césaire's argument at the same time. And so I'm wondering what the relationship is between the world making that you're talking about and the project of Third Worldism. That's one question. And is it a continuation of it? Is there some kind of a difference that's going on? And then the second thing that I'm curious about is, based on what you just said, is in Adon Getacheo's book, she has this part early on where she talks about Du Bois and how he effectively offers a framework to globalize, to think about Jim Crow as being globalized. And I'm wondering if you would agree with that framework. I'm thinking about a conversation we had yesterday, or whether or not that kind of framework puts America kind of at the center of talking about race in international forum.
Would you want me to? I was going to ask you to answer that question. Because yeah, but I mean, just the first one. The last part, I do agree with that, and of course, Du Bois had laid out the idea that when he had this very interesting essay, or at least there was a statement in the essay, where he says the color line belts the world. And when he wrote Souls of Black Folk, he was always thinking about the globe. He talks about, the colonies and the islands of the sea, for example. And if you lived in the turn of the 20th century, and if you only knew about the Philippines, you knew the color line belts the world. Does it take on different forms? Certainly. But that idea of a kind of global white supremacy, global coloring, global Jim Crow, also created conditions for forms of solidarity. To speak to the question of third worldism versus or as a form of world making, I think there's definitely a relationship between the two, but I do think, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but that world making opens up even greater possibilities. Third worldism also is based on the idea that there is a primary path of liberation, and that's through the nation state. That national self-determination, national liberation through the nation state is the path. And they took it for granted. And with that came a lot of problems, including the problems that I ended with, talking about forms of internal national oppressions of other peoples, of minority peoples, of peoples who may not be incorporated within a national identity, whatever that identity might be. especially given the fact that the modern nations under colonialism, especially in Africa, were forms of bringing together around boundaries that were completely artificial, peoples whose relationship might have been friendly, antagonistic, or produced as antagonistic as a result of colonial domination. So in some ways, it's a nation-state's problem. Gary Wilder has this book where he talks about Aimé Césaire and Leopold Senghor, and that they actually had a very different strategy. And there's some limits to the strategy, but think about this as a strategy for post-colonial, to the post-colonial world, and that is not to have the nation state, but to take the form of empire, in this case the French Empire, and to make that a confederation. So that's to say that it's a socialist confederation of all the imperial nations in which France is not the head, but it's a different kind of configuration where you eliminate those borders and boundaries, you don't force people into national sovereignty, you end up having a socialist, so not an empire, but the deconstruction of the empire in place of confederation of this entity, so that it's about scale, it's about democracy, and in this case, the people of Martinique and the people of Senegal will have as much say in the direction of this confederation as the people of Paris or Marseille or any place like that. And of course, it didn't work because Europeans aren't going for that stuff. But it was an interesting idea and an alternative. And so part of world making is, what are those alternatives? Native sovereignty is not the same as nation building. So what is the models of native sovereignty? What does that mean? Not as against European, North American, South American forms of domination, but as something that emerges out of indigenous thought. What are the alternatives? And I think that we could think about that in more broad terms, but I want to hear what Laura.
Well, I think first let me start by I don't know if we're going to agree or disagree. You didn't really harp on the thing about Jim Crow, except to say that you agree with it. And I want to, maybe I'll start there and then go into world making. So Arash and I were discussing this last night. The jury is still out in my head on whether or not, in fact, what's happening is the globalization of Jim Crow. One, the reason I say that is because I think in the world, we tend to let, U.S. racism, which is one of, the most emblematic and the most violent and the most kind of crude, have a dominion over racism in the whole world. And oftentimes, critique or understanding of race globally or racism becomes, an analogy to U.S. racism. So we begin to see, but here, and why do I want to distinguish that? As I think that there's a difference between anti-blackness and racism, right? Racism is a social construct, and we can racialize within each community, and that racialization looks different in each community. So that you can't really understand racism, for example, in the Gulf states of the Middle East, if you don't understand migrant labor, who are primarily Southeast Asians, and South Asians who are racialized and excluded as other. So you can't use that framework of our black-white binary to understand racism in the rest of the world. It won't work. And so why then I push back against the idea that we're exporting Jim Crow to the world. Now I think that does happen. And I think that happens primarily through our wars abroad and our military, our soldiers abroad, right? Who are exporting these ideas with them. But if we were to internationalize Jim Crow, Jim Crow precedes the Convention Against Apartheid in 1973. But had it not, we would have conceived of Jim Crow as apartheid. And it certainly fits the bill. And it certainly is a crime against humanity. And so again, just to kind of make it more global and less US-centric, which I think has its limits in how we think about this, which is, in my own work of trying to think through racism in Israel, the easiest way is to distinguish Jewish Israelis and native Palestinians, right? That native settler binary. But when we do that, we kind of overlook all of the internal racialization that happens against Ethiopians, Eritreans, the Middle Eastern Jews, of Morocco and Algeria and Lebanon and Syria and throughout and Yemen, a large the Yemeni population, right? How are they racialized? Why did this population of Middle Eastern Jews, for example, at the same time of Third World upheaval, organize themselves as the Israeli Panthers? Because they were fighting an anti-racist struggle. And so how does this kind of export, this binary, limit our analysis of anti-racist struggle and its possibilities? So that's that question. In terms of the question about world making and third worldism, what are we doing today from what we were doing in the past? I just want to build on what Robin said, which is absolutely right. I think the third world upheaval was a moment where we were imagining a different future against imperialism. But as I described this kind of split in our thinking, there was a framework that took us on the path of basically the nation state as being the epitome of self-determination versus a path that we've not continued necessarily. And so in many ways, yes, our world making continues to be a legacy of that and of unfinished business. We have not pursued this path of what does freedom look like beyond the state. Now that can be really complicated for us because that's our reality. What is there beyond the state? And so here, just complicate a few things. One, the state as a political concept is only about 200 years old. This is not the only thing that we've used to organize ourselves. It doesn't have to be the only way that we organize ourselves, right? So it's about extricating and being imaginative about that. The second thing I'll say is, oftentimes when we want to say something like we want something beyond the state, the first question is, well, what will replace it? Right? But that's a circular argument. We'll replace the state with another state. It's like, when we think about prison abolition, but what will replace the prisons? Maybe instead of asking that question, we should be asking the question of, what created the prison in the first place, right? What anxieties were we responding to? How do we fill those populations? How does that fulfill a political economy? And what is it that we can do that diverts those penal populations early on? So rather than asking how do we replace the prisons, maybe we should be asking how really should we organize our budget so that there is no need for a prison. Maybe instead of spending that money on building a new juvenile prison, we should be just spending more money on schools, right? And teachers. Maybe we should pay teachers a living wage, right? Maybe that's what we should be doing. So in this question of, and that's what I do at the end of the book, which is I think going to be the next project for me. I don't know the answer. What is beyond the state? Where are we going? And I'm trying to look for answers to that question by frankly looking at what activists are doing. Because I think activists are our theorists. Everybody that we've named was involved in activism. They're figuring it out. Artists are also the visionaries, right? So I don't think it's not a mathematical equation, right? It's about something that we're visioning and building even in the ways that we're relating to one another.
Before you pass on, I actually want to totally agree with you on the whole issue of global Jim Crow. I didn't get to that chapter, by the way, so I'm just based on what you said. So I didn't realize that the argument was based on the export of American race structures.
It's just a reference.
Yeah, no, because that makes a difference because part of Du Bois's point about the colorline belts of the world wasn't that it came from the U.S., but it was part of the transformation of. So in that case, I completely agree with you. Any idea? I mean, what's interesting too is that colonial rulers are in conversation with other colonial rulers, in conversation with the U.S. too. And there's all this research on the fact that whether you're talking about South Africa or you're talking about Rhodesia, they're in conversation with planters in the South and colonial rulers in Shanghai and places like that to figure out how to manage these populations. In India, I mean, can you imagine John Stuart Mill without India? You know, I mean, they're all thinking about like how to manage these subject populations. So I think that, I actually, if it is about the export of the U.S., then I think I wouldn't agree with that, I think. But you're always right, though. I mean, you're always right.
Get you a teacher who blows you up like this.
To be fair, the book is not making the argument about the export. I was making that argument to provoke a little bit. Questions from the audience?
My question is around the Black Palestinian solidarity that you mentioned, and how we should use this as an analytic rather than sort of an identity politics framework. So it's around how sort of what I'm getting from you is sort of a need for sort of changes in how we see Palestinians and blacks, right? That's sort of an epistemological rupturing or shift. But for me, a challenge comes in with that sort of proximity that people have to these subjects, whether it be blacks in America, and having their own unique set of struggles to which they are constantly being bombarded, and then to like sort of draw those similarities, and sort of how, to what extent can, at least in the mind, how do you convince or show to a Black American who is experiencing these forms of systematic racism that is also a similar reality for Palestinians, and that together, this world-making, new world-making, how do you realize that when both groups are personally experiencing something at the same time? If that makes sense.
A lot of sense. So I'm not going to convince. I think, so let me just start by saying, one, I would love to hear Robin's take on this. Obviously, I want to hear him on everything, but there's groups like the Dream Defenders, and there's, or Black Youth Project, or Blacks for Palestine, who are making this argument, and the argument that they're trying to make and draw our attention to is that U.S. racism that is endured, and the brunt of it that's endured by Black communities is actually part of a global system that's co-constitutive with a practice of colonialism and imperialism. And that we can't understand the Black condition and the horizon of Black liberation without also understanding the U.S.'s relationship to Israel and its desire for, imperial domination in the Middle East, through the proliferation of military bases, through the provision of unequivocal economic, military, and political aid, through the provision and the exchange of carceral and military technologies that makes these systems aligned in many ways as part of a single structure, right? So I'm gonna pause there to tell you, my concern is how do we convince Palestinians? Okay? That's my concern. That's my struggle right now that I'm dealing with, because I see most Palestinians that are part and adopt this analytic are based here in North America. And Palestinians in Palestine that I've come into contact with understand racism as a struggle against colonialism. So very much understand anti-Black racism as practiced in apartheid South Africa, but are at a loss to understand anti-Black racism in the United States when there's been a Black president. Right? So there is, that's where I see the potential of world making. And so the way, I'm just, by the way, sharing my thoughts with you, I don't know yet anything. But one of the things that I think about is that, for example, when Palestinians do the work of what I think needs to be done, which is abandoning, the Palestinian state as the height of our liberation, when we do that, which is really scary, because what comes for Palestinians if they don't have that state? Right? They become, in some ways, very much equivalent to Blacks in the United States, who also, like the height of Black liberation is not, a separate state, although it could be, right? But it's not that. It's this condition, it's unknown. The future is very unknown and scary. But what then if we imagine whatever Palestinians can figure out, they're not only figuring out for themselves, but we're figuring out for the world. So that, for example, the use of Israeli militarization, they're experimenting with new weapons in the Gaza Strip. So the Gaza Strip and the wars that we see there are not just the site of grotesque violence. They're actually laboratories for new weapons. and for new methods of warfare. And I chronicle some of that in the last chapter of the book. But new methods of warfare that have shrunk who is a civilian, that have expanded the rights of combatants to use force. That's not limited. That doesn't stay in Gaza. Israel then exports that technology and these new legal frameworks to the United States, which then exports it in their targeting practices in Somalia, in the Philippines, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, right? The weapons that are being used for surveillance that Israel develops to monitor Palestinians are being exported all over the world, including to Brazil, including to the United States. Our surveillance technology that the US has perfected is being produced by Israel, right? So the wall that President Trump wants to build, right? Israel wants to build the wall because they've built the best one, right? So these ideas, when Palestinians are struggling, if we can figure this out, we can figure out answers for the rest of the world and not just ourselves. The central, any Palestinians in the, you don't have to out yourselves, I'm Palestinian, but the central tenet of the Palestinian struggle is the return of refugees, right? But refugees exist globally, right? This idea of not being able to return, or of not having a home, of not having protection. The only way that you can activate your human rights is through some state. So if you don't have a state, you really don't have rights. Also a concept from Hannah Arendt, that, you know, the most vulnerable state of being is the state of being human. Because you have to have a state or a nationality to be able to practice and effectuate those rights. So the condition of figuring out the answer for Palestinian refugees is also an answer for global refugee populations. And so one way that I advocate for us to think about that, I do two things. One is to say that rather than think of the return of Palestinian refugees as the triumph of the Palestinian struggle, I would like us to imagine the return of Palestinian refugees as the beginning. Now that they've all come home, what future can we build? What can Palestinians create in terms of community that offers more protection, more dignity, and more satisfaction to Jewish Israelis than Israel has been able to offer, right? And the other way that I think about it is to think about why are Palestinians answering the question of what we should do with the 12,000 asylum seekers from Africa in Israel that Israel wants to deport back to sure death? Because they're black, right? So these are challenges for us, and I think that they answer a lot of much bigger questions.
So you have to say more about that, because you wrote this brilliant short essay called The Nakba and Anti-Blackness. It was 2015, I think it was. And you should say more about that, because that lays out a lot of the argument, both in terms of what comes next, and that is, how do you move beyond the replacement of settler colonialism with forms of anti-blackness, and what that means, especially in terms of the way that some African Americans have already dismissed Palestinians as anti-black, because there's Palestinian Americans who they engage with in circumstances where they would experience that. Could you say more about that?
Sure. Okay, let me say that quickly, which is to say, not only do they say that Palestinians are anti-black, one, they're right. There is a history of anti-blackness. Most immigrants in this country are socialized to understand that their well-being, their security, is predicated on their distance from blackness, right? And an investment in whiteness and an investment in becoming white, right? That's something that all immigrants are taught. So notice where even refugees, when they come to this country, they don't go live in the ghetto. That's not their dream. That's not the horizon of what they want. That's not who they align themselves with. And so that's something that's very deep. The other thing that's really deep in even Middle Eastern history is a history of slavery, right? So these are things that are real and we have to excavate. And I think are what complicates why Black Palestinian transnational solidarity is much more productive as an analytic than it is an identity framework, right? Because it wants to deal with these things. It's the commitment to deal with these things, right? What I'm arguing and what I do in this essay, which is based on a longer article, is basically to say that we should complicate the ideas of race in Israel, that Israel exports, that even Zionism. I basically argue that Zionism is a resistance movement for Jews who see that the establishment of a national homeland as the proper response to systematic anti-Jewish bigotry, right? But what they are resisting is basically the orientalizing of Jews in Europe, of their, what Aziza Khuzam has described, their Yiddish language as being backwards, their distinctive religious features, their smell, their dirtiness, right? All these things that are Orientalist tropes that basically makes Jews ineligible even for citizenship in several European states, right? But the resistance to that, rather than combating that white supremacist framework that excludes Jews, Zionism internalizes it, right? Rather than being a resistance movement to white supremacy, it becomes a bid to become white by them establishing and creating a Jewish national home that basically makes them closer to being European finally. And this is the work of Max Eil and Shireen Said-Ali, which I encourage you read, that they base this off of their reading of Jacques Derrida. Anyway, see, reading? Yes, Professor? And so, but because of that because they've internalized white supremacy and are aspiring to become white and more like Europeans, that's why when they're now Jews of the Middle East are coming to Israel and immigrating in the early 1950s, they're kidnapping their children to place them in the homes of Ashkenazi Israelis so that they can be civilized. They're only teaching, they're settling Middle Eastern Jews on the periphery, where the frontier with Arab warring states, because these are expendable lives. They're only teaching the history, the only curriculum that's being taught in Israel is a history of Europe. It's not a history of Jews in the Middle East, right? Jews in the Middle East are Arab, which means that they speak Arabic. They have more, it's what Ala Shahat does. More reading, y'all. It's what Ala Shahat says. She's an Iraqi Jew whose family immigrates to Israel. And her grandmother learned that in order to become Israeli, she had to cease being Iraqi. Right? It was an exercise of self-devastation, her words. Right? And in fact, in Israel, Middle Eastern Jews are known as Middle Eastern Jews, or Mizrahim, and not as Arab Jews, in order to, solidify that distance with the rest of the Arab world. And Palestinians, who are natives and are citizens of Israel, about 2 million, are known as the Arab Israelis. That's not an accident. And now you have, after 1967, that the most vehement opponents to Palestinian liberation are, in fact, the Middle Eastern Jewish population. Because what's at stake for them is how different will they be from the Palestinian if there is no Israel to distinguish them, and now they're all Arab, right? Anyway, so what I'm saying is, part of the work that Palestinians can do is to envision different forms of solidarity along racial lines. That what if we engaged in not just an anti-settler colonial struggle, but we also engaged in an anti-racist struggle. And so that's why, I think that if we're not attuned to that, then we may recreate a state that's just as racist and just as problematic.
So, you have to clap for that. That's the perfect lead up to my little brief contribution, which is, when you think of like the imagined black person you're trying to recruit or organize, we often think of the people we're working with, we're trying to recruit or organize, as not just pragmatic, but as utilitarian. That is, what's good for them in their community or neighborhood at that moment. But part of the history of the Black radical movement is that their land, their space, was never big enough. The globe was what they looked at. People of dark skin was not always enough. So you think about when the U.S. occupied Hawaii, among the leaders of the Anti-Imperialist League who fought were people like T. Thomas Fortune, African Americans, who said the occupation of Hawaii, that's a violation of sovereign rights of the Hawaiian people. We're in solidarity. Now they could have been drinking, they could have been having fun, having a party, but they're out there protesting on behalf of the Hawaiians. protesting on behalf of the slaughter of indigenous peoples. Marcus Garvey, right? Where did Marcus Garvey come from? He came from Jamaica, and he wanted to build a movement, but he learned about that movement by first going to Panama and organizing workers there, and then going to Europe, to England, where he met with Irish nationalists and worked with them and was inspired by what was going on there. When he gave his first speech on the streets of Harlem, he laid out the red, black, and green flag. Initially, the red was for the Russian Revolution, the green was for the Irish Revolution, and the black was for the Black Revolution. And it changed over time. If you think about just what it means to make this imaginative leap to basically say the people of India and Gandhi, they're my people. And I've never met them, I don't read Sanskrit, I can't speak Hindi, but those are my people, and to stand up for them. I mean, I wrote a book about the Communist Party in Alabama, which is like 99% black. I'm sorry, 95% black. And imagine you got sharecroppers in 1933 who are going out in Tallapoosa County, Alabama, with flyers saying, "Free Ernst Thälmann." Who's Ernst Thälmann? He's a German communist who was in jail in Alabama. And half the people couldn't even read that. They knew who he was, but it took someone to write up that. My point is that the history of internationalism is much deeper than we think, and that it's not that people thought that if we could free these people, that my life would be better. It's that it's an imperative to fight against racism wherever it is, against national forms of oppression, against all forms of oppression, because that's who we are. The Bible says we're supposed to do that, right? The Quran says we're supposed to do that. You know, your mama says you're supposed to do that. And that's just the way it is. But there's something about that commitment, because I remember a long time ago, Nora asked me to contribute a piece on the question of Palestine relations, and I was trying to talk about solidarity. Sometimes you actually stand up for the people who don't like you. The history of Reconstruction are black people who are former slaves, who are basically passing legislation in South Carolina saying that all people, irrespective of race, have a right to free universal public education. You know, that the people who the crackers who call me nigger, right, are the ones who should have those rights as well as I do. That's a huge conceptual leap, right? And that is what we talk about. We're talking about sort of, rather than identity as embodied, it's physical, genetic relationships, as opposed to thinking about histories and how those histories are intertwined. And even histories that we don't even know about, how we can imagine those histories. And that's part of that history as well.
We have time, I think, for one more question.
I'll just ask it. I'd like to go back to this discussion of the legitimization of fear. And so I would just like to ask, so what differentiates the social activist being labeled as a lawbreaker fighting to like legitimize fear versus like the social activist being labeled as a criminal? And specifically, like I'd like to talk about like, so what differentiates something being labeled as, say, like civil disobedience versus something being labeled, say, as like violent protest? Yeah, thank you.
That's a good question. So when I was sharing that, I was describing two different things, right? That what we legitimate as fear is also that how we tend to describe violence, and whether or not we see, because some of us are just pacifists and don't want to see violence in any context, right? But there is, for those of us who see that violence is necessary and can be used in self-defense, this becomes a more complicated story. And on the international level, it becomes the most complicated. Because, for example, you all are familiar with frameworks of this entire discussion of legitimate versus illegitimate violence is something that's captured in what we label as terrorism, or not. And it's interesting to know that terrorism does not have an international definition in international law. It does not have one. There is no agreed treaty against it. In fact, the State Department doesn't have one single definition of terrorism. And much of the debate on the international level is not about what I'll define terrorism, right? As the targeting of civilians in order to achieve a political outcome. The debate on the international level is who's doing the targeting and who are the civilians. And so states, powerful former colonial powers, existing colonial powers, including the UK, the US, and Israel, have opposed this definition, this broad definition, because it basically contemplates that states can participate in terrorism. And the whole idea is that if you're a state, then you can't be a terrorist. And if you kill any civilians, then they're collateral damage. And it wasn't targeted, as opposed to non-state actors who target civilians as a matter of course, right? And so here we get into this discussion of, but how does just then the framework and the discourse obscure all sorts of violences that we're not paying attention to, right? And so that's kind of what I was getting to here, for us to really critically examine the way that the US and Israel and other really powerful states use violence and do target civilians. So for example, and I was a member of the National Lawyers Guild. So for me, academy is a second career. I'm a human rights attorney by training and an organizer, I guess, because I was born a woman. So I agitated since a very young age. My first protest was in my home with a broom turned upside down, saying, "Hell no, I want to clean." Just so you all know. And so, but I traveled as an attorney with the National Lawyers Guild to Gaza in 2009, February 2009, which is after the first large-scale Israeli offensive known as Operation Cast Lead. And the discourse that we got, the story that we heard about like some upwards of 1,000 Palestinians killed, is that Hamas used all these Palestinians as human shields, right? And so the victims were being blamed for their own death. And yet interview after interview after interview were horror stories that Palestinians told us, and we're just documenting as legal observers, of being targeted, of Palestinians running away and being shot in the back, right? Of not given a chance to evacuate their homes and one-ton bombs being dropped on residential buildings in the middle of the night, right? That's not human shielding. That's targeting, right? That's terrorism, if we're going to use that language. And yet coming back and trying to share that is just an uphill battle. And the battle begins by not believing Palestinians in the first place, right? They're not to be trusted. And if you tell their stories, they're biased and they hate Jews. And that's why they're just trying to make Israel look bad, right? So anyway, so then how does that translate? That's how I'm thinking about the self-defense. How does that translate to what do we consider legitimate civil disobedience versus violence? I mean, this is also something that it's just contested terrain. I don't think it's a scientific equation. I think it's what we make it, right? But it does merit scrutiny that during the Baltimore uprisings, that the news, CNN, I was in a flight, and so I was watching CNN, and I was so angry because Freddie Gray had just been killed, right? In the back of a police van with his arms tied behind his back, okay? And they called it a suicide. And yet all that CNN was running was how black protesters were destroying CVS windows. Okay? So here again, this is an emphasis on whose life matters, whose testimony matters, who gets to tell us the story. So this isn't about, legal definitions. This is really a battle over narrative and about who we listen to.
Please join me in thanking Dr.